to end for today. Very quickly, a point about those podcasts. I just noticed that it does take a couple hours for it to get coded and uploaded, and then I have to copy it to the Jackson School course. So if you're in the Jackson School course and you don't see it right away, unfortunately, you just have to be patient. I can see how much people visit it, and I think it's probably not a crucial thing that they're not up there right away because people don't look at them very much. But if you are looking at them and you're registered in one course or the other, then just know that I'm aware of that, and I copy it as soon as I can. But they are there for you. Also, I was just thinking that it's very easy for me to just upload these discussion notes that I'm writing so they show in the podcast, and I'll just start uploading that with titles that will help you find that. So that'll be available too for your review. To turn to Copperheart, let's just start with, I want to just, now that you should have read the novel, share your thoughts with me. Tell me what you think. Anyone? Emily.
I just thought there were a lot of dead ends. Like, I feel like the author brought up just a lot of things with the characters and just like never really went
Okay.
Like, there was only one part, and I thought it was pretty subtle, but Maria, I felt, was kind of like having a maternal instinct with Annalini.
Mm-hmm.
I kind of thought that would progress into like her having like an internal like, oh, like I want to have kids now because I've helped this girl with her anorexia. But I mean, she only really did that in like one scene.
Okay, so it's the problem of lots of good questions at the beginning, but not very well resolved. It's every writer's problem, right? We have a lot of good ideas, and you get enthusiastic, and you're like, oh my God, how am I going to finish this? And I don't have time to write that novel, so you chop, and try to neatly tie things off. But the reader, the careful reader, thank you, Emily, can notice those trails that don't get elaborated. Yeah, Caitlin.
Well, I think on that note, part of it also, in terms of like personal development kind of stuff, it really did read like it was something that's part of a series. We're going to get more later, so there's not. I think when there's with Maria herself, there's not such a strong need to finish off all those things like right in that particular story because there's more to come.
Okay, so this is of course the solution to the problem that Emily wrote for perhaps in the mind of the writer and also the reader can get it too. Is that it's serious fiction that these things will get developed further, and that the kind of portrait that we get in this novel we'll see developed in other novels. So this is a place, and of course, in a way, the point that Emily makes, you could see maybe from a more cynical perspective as a canny choice. Leave some open-ended stuff that encourages the reader to come back. And then, that keeps them coming back for more, right? You don't want to give them too much because then you got nothing left for the next novel. So you don't want to write too much, right? Keep it, give them what they need. George?
I actually didn't really like the villain they picked for the novel.
Okay.
After reading through the Todorov article, I was looking at some of the rules, and one in particular, which was that the villain had to be someone who was close. But the villain they chose seemed kind of distant, and also his motives were really guessable for that matter, or even it was hard to figure out, really hard to figure out from all the clues.
Okay, so 2 points there. One about reading for genre using Todorov's article. I think those are again the list that SS it's a list that this writer from the 1920s, SS Van Dyne, came up with, and that's for the whodunit. So we can ask. It raises a sort of corollary question: is this a whodunit? How would we categorize this one? But second, George points out that the motive is not very well developed. It's sort of greed in general, but not worked out in a way that makes sense for the character. Leah?
I just wasn't a huge fan of the writing itself. I thought it was very simplistic, too simplistic.
Okay.
I don't know if that's because it was translated or how it actually is.
Writing too simplistic. It's interesting you say that because I have heard that comment before about the Finnish writing, and the reason I've heard it is because I wrote this book a couple of years ago called Crime, Fantasy, and Scandinavia. I was really interested in this autobiographical narration, and so I thought, okay, I'm going to run with that. So there's a chapter in that book on Lena Lehtinen. So if you want to see what I think, you can go there and read it. But that was what a lot of Finnish people said to me. Like, how come you're interested in that? It's so simplistic. It's like a high schooler's, thing. And I was kind of like embarrassed that I was like writing about it. But then I thought, that's fine. I can live with that. But it is interesting to think, like, what is it that makes it simplistic? Is it a lack of psychological development? Or is it simplistic? Maybe it's not simplistic. Another point people have made about those novels is the series defense that Caitlin, raised. And that is that, in a way, she's a sort of a simplistic character in the beginning, and she develops over time. The writer tries to develop her, and it does go until, like, I haven't read the most recent ones, but at some point she's got 2 kids and some more complicated family life, et cetera, et cetera. So that the development of her own autobiography is an important part of it. And I've interviewed the author, and she said that if you read the novels, you find the sentence structures change. They become more, there are greater numbers of clauses, and the vocabulary changes. So that, she I guess, invoked the series defense herself, too. So, yeah. Christine, right.
On the same note of the motive and the villain being kind of questionable, I think because of that, as you're reading it, there's not much about it. There's not much about why that would be the cause of the murder, and then you find out at the end it just seems very sudden.
Okay, so insufficient clues, maybe you could say, that she doesn't set it up in a way where there's a real payoff.
No aha.
Yeah, it's more like a than an aha. Yeah, good point. And this is right away we start to see these are kind of technical, or well, I shouldn't. That's a more negatively loaded term. Formal criticisms about how we read crime fiction, and in a way, this is a very extremely old point. This is Aristotle's point about organic unity, or Aristotle says in the Poetics that a artwork should be an organic whole. And when we think of crime fiction, if we want to think of it as an artwork, as an organic whole, we want a balance there. Each character should be developed in a full way. There should be a balance of clues that both deceive us and allow us to kind of guess. A lot of the George's point and Christine's point are both about the form, right? And Emily's too, in a way. Casey?
Yeah, how do you know that interesting because had she not received that phone call, they probably would have never known that he was the real guy. They were getting ready to arrest Johnny. So it's almost as if, like, he wanted her to know that it was him. I don't know. It's like, oh, it's me. I don't know. So, yeah, it was, it's weird, like, had she never gotten that phone call.
So, I'm going to say coincidence, right? And, of course, this is, again, you put it in a very sort of generous way to the novel, that it worked, it seemed like you were suggesting, but some critics would say that when you're relying on coincidences, you're in trouble, right? Ideally, you want things to develop naturally. It's almost as though it had to happen that way, right? That's what we like. That's where you start to get the goosebumps, right? Because I saw it coming. It had to happen that way. That's why it's so sad. That's why it works. But when it's all of a sudden, and then he got a phone call, that can seem kind of forced, or like they had to find some way out of this jam, and that's what they came up with. The writer came up with. So you can see it different ways, But this is one, again, thinking about these formal criticisms, this is a great place to write a paper on the form of the novel. A lot of these observations can lead to a thesis. I think one of the first prompts is about how the novels work formally, drawing on Todorov. So you can certainly go in that direction to write a paper. Cameron?
I'm not really sure which way I feel about it, but it seemed so cliche at the end for the villain to tell his whole scheme and kind of just moment and allow her to have the time to react. It seemed just a little bit. Yeah, that's the, it's the obligatory confession. Yeah, absolutely. So, the cliche. It's the, we can think about the different novels and how they deal with these things, deal with the cliche or avoid it or whatever. I want to say one of the reasons I chose the novel was because there's just not as much good finished material in translation, and this is, I think,
of the choices out there, it's the most interesting in a way, not necessarily the best written, but one of the more interesting ones. So with it comes some of these flaws, I'm afraid. Elizabeth.
I didn't like the resolution to the Ella and Maddie with the whole grant thing. It just
okay.
Really a lot of the other characters that had other subplots didn't end. They were just and nobody cared that he took all this money.
Okay, he paid it back. It worked out. Yeah.
Yeah, but it just seems like something that should have been a bigger deal at the end, but wasn't.
Okay, so failure to resolve subplots satisfactorily. And that's, you mentioned this Ella and Matti example in particular. So yeah, there's these sorts of, again, it's a little bit, it echoes, it's a specific example of something that Emily said, that there's these things that get developed that don't really play out. Agnes?
It's interesting because it's my first time reading this crime fiction, and more so a crime fiction novel.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was expecting more of a, we went over the whole subgenres of whodunit, thriller, and med suspense thing. I was expecting more of a thriller,
okay,
where it's everything, going on really quickly. But I felt the first half of the reading that you signed was a lot more prolonged and kind of just delayed until at the end, the few last chapters at the end, it was just kind of going on right there.
Okay, yeah. So
just everything seemed a little delayed.
Okay, this is actually we'll also put delayed. Your words. Other people feel that start slow. This is one of the criticisms you always hear of Scandinavian crime fiction. It starts slow. Often American crime fiction or other forms, UK.
He was dead.
Yeah, there's usually a very boom, get him, hook him in, and then it keeps going. And this stuff often starts pretty slow. Keep your eye on the opening as we go along. Think about it. Why is that opening slow? What's the point? What's the author trying to do with that slow opening? And then how does it work for the reader? Those two different questions. But I offer you that this is a criticism. If you go look on Amazon or something like that, starting slow is something that you'll see. And then if you read about these things, read criticism of them as well, that it's a typical criticism. I'm going to try to get 1 point for people who haven't made points already. Yeah, in the back. Name? Hannah.
I don't know if this is in all crime fiction novels or if it's just this one because it's a series, but I felt like there's a lot of information that could have just been left out.
Okay.
Waiting for it to be tied into the end.
Well, can you give us an example?
Just kind of even the whole how they went into so much background information with certain
maybe Kaisa coming out.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, what's that?
How they went into background information with, is it Annalena?
Uh-huh.
Stuff like that, and then that wasn't that. I don't know, just seeing all those.
Okay, so two things came up. You said Annalena, the anorexic, and then Kaisa, the javelin thrower. Agnes shouted out, who comes out of the closet during the novel. And just for the sake of time, I want to sort of turn on those last points, and let's just take a minute or so to talk to people sitting next to you. Why do you think she included that, and then what are the arguments for including it or excluding it? Because this is something she does a lot of in these novels, is work in these sorts of subplots, and the question is, what's going on with them? Why include them? And then what are the arguments for including them or excluding them? And the reason I'm asking this question and putting a little bit of emphasis on it is you could call this social criticism, right? Anorexia, the public lesbian. Those are issues that get some attention in the media, and she seems to be latching onto them. And the question is, what's she doing with it, and what are the arguments for inclusion or exclusion of that material? And those are pretty open-ended questions, so run with them whatever way you want. But let's take a couple minutes to talk about that amongst yourselves.
No, I saw that they were like, I don't That's social. That's social. Oh yeah, there are a lot of like athletes that are right. That's what I'm saying. And it was even. It was like, oh, you don't like that? Like, oh. It was very sudden though. I was just like, yo, like, I think that's what I said. That's it. Same with the side. Too funny. It's just so out of context though. I was just like, yeah, like, oh. Well, I don't say a problem, it's just random. Like, I think I would have been like, even like, oh yeah, that would have been a good I didn't even think about that. There were a lot of like, what happens between like their lives but it is serious like it might I mean she's try to get when he went out and slamming out his butt, you know, I was just like, what an idiot. Like, you are stupid. You deserve to die. Like, that's what I was thinking. I was like, what is such a little bitch? That's what took me back. That's what my point. I would get back at my town and blow up the mine. Yeah, so she always does it. That's It was a fun and easy week. That's what I did. One judge, it's good. If you like the song, that's
Okay, let's hear what people have to say. So the question was about this sort of Hannah's initial point about missing information, but it was something we talked about. So these are kind of social criticism hooks, you could say. And the question was, what does she do with them, and what would the arguments be for including this stuff or getting rid of it? Yeah, name?
Kathleen. So I thought Annalina's anorexia was kind of a good point to include in the story, primarily because she didn't really have the best relationship with her mom, and she even said, I could see why somebody would want to kill her. But considering she was so unhealthy, she couldn't have possibly thrown her mom off of the tower. So it immediately almost eliminated her as a suspect.
So in a way, it's interesting to, it's a reflection on a relationship between a mother and a daughter that maybe adds some texture to the novel, but in terms of its function in a crime novel, it doesn't really work because if she's so unhealthy, she can't physically do what would be required to, take out her mom. So then you can get a little two sides to that particular one. Yeah, other thoughts? Ben?
Well, I just thought it was pretty unrealistic when Johnny got hurt and she carried him up like on her back or whatever. So I didn't like that part. Like when he started explaining the plot, like how he committed commit the crime and everything on that.
Hey, that's not about the question. But that's actually, it's a good point that, again, it's a sort of a formal criticism, right, where it fails the plausibility test. When you put him down in the mine and then you have this big shootout, how do you get him out? It's actually, I'm just going to tell a little story on the side because I interviewed this author. And one of the things I really noticed was that as the novels went along, she's always finding diaries, and there's all this sort of autobiographical writing that's in the novels. Like, in a later novel, Annie Lena would have a diary or something like that she would read. And I think she says early on here, I love to get my nose in other people's affairs. And the character says that many times, and then she gets in other people's affairs and finds all these sorts of autobiographical texts people have written in letters and things like that. And I was asking her, I thought, oh, that's really neat in this interview, and so I was wanting to talk to her about that. And she said, actually, it's just a technique, because it's really hard to invent the dialogue for all these things, and so if you just find the diary, then you can write about it, and it really helps prolong this. So there's evidence of the kind of the technique side of it, where people are pointing out a failure technique, and I think Ben has put his finger on one thing where it's sort of implausible thing. On the other hand, Kali is depicted very physical, and that that's emphasizing her physicality at the end there. And, of course, that's a bigger point in the novel, that she is a young woman who actually is very physical and identifies with a very physical presence, right? It's no mistake that she admires and looks to this character, Kaisa, right, who's the big medalist javelin thrower, and she wants to be like that herself. She goes to the gym, and she's running and all these things to keep fit. And so, in a way, that's in character for her to do that, even if it maybe is a little bit implausible. Christine?
So in the same style as like her technique when writing the book, we talked about how it seems like she took one social challenge, like the society versus women, and she thought of so many examples and included all of them.
Okay.
It's hard to pick one that's better than the others because they were all just barely
Okay.
tie in as a whole.
Great. So there's this shotgun approach, or failure to choose. Right? It's another classic problem with a writer. Right? They say that what does a good writer do? They choose and they edit. They get rid of things. Right? It's easy to come up with all kinds of good ideas. The difficult part is selecting the ones that matter, where you want to put your emphasis, and then organizing them in a way that has that elegance. That's the hard part. And Christine's critique here is that, in fact, what happens here is that there's like lots of good ideas. You know, the sports hero who's a lesbian, or the teenage anorexic who has a troubled relationship to her mother. Those are interesting characters for various reasons, and yet, when you just pile them one on top of the other, the individual interest of those characters and then their sort of status as ideas, right? These are ideas that are in the public sphere about, eating disorders or queer identities, whatever. Those are things that we talk a lot about, and that are as the culture changes, there's debate about what those attitudes are and what those identities are, whatever. And as a result, they can be important, and yet if you just they become tokens, right? If you don't do it right. Sarah.
And also, I thought that a lot of them too, like in is it
Kaisa, yeah.
Annalena, and then also with Nina too, that actually had less to do with what they were actually about, but each of them, because you said that Maria does come across as this really strong, almost masculine character, that in every one of those situations, she's really sweet, and just people trust her, and it kind of added another dimension to her character. She played the same role in every one of those situations.
And that's that she's sweet and kind of
sympathetic, I guess.
Okay, a good listener, someone who's she's that is true that pretty consistently she's there for her friends, right? Ready to listen and ready to kind of play the friend role. Yeah, and then wanting to be friends to more people too. Other points, Charlie.
On Kaiser's sexuality, I think that it redirected her motive. Everyone of the main characters had some sort of reason why they might have committed the murders, and it directed her feelings for Johnny and trying to get Marita out of the way to feelings for Marita and being really angry that Johnny was
Yeah, so it's kind of like a twist, right? What looked like was the case can't be the case, and I mean, so then is it sort of just a trick that she uses there, or Do you have something?
Yeah.
Go ahead.
This book's also 20 years old.
That's true.
And I don't know Finland's like how they feel about the homosexual community, and I don't know if like writing having a lesbian character like 20 years ago, if that was like a huge step forward, or if that's just like that was fairly typical.
I think it's probably maybe the main thing is it's like a rural setting, and it's sort of a plopping down a character who would be unexpected perhaps. But she's written another novel, maybe that's probably like 5 years old, 8 years old, about a very similar character who's like some superstar endurance runner who then turns out to be gay, but he's trying to hide his identity and so forth. And that becomes then the twist that the whole thing turns on. And again, she plays a very similar role where she's kind of a good friend listening to this person and so forth. But, I think that probably it has a little more resonance 20 years ago, as you point out, than it would today. So yeah, this is maybe what it's a sort of a historical novel. What was a social issue 20 years ago is sort of, a token character, looks like a token character that is not very interesting today, perhaps. Other thoughts about these things? And then we have 15 minutes left here. Any further things that people want to add here? Hannah, you have your hand up for a while.
I was just going to go off of the failure to choose where you kind of discussed. I actually includes a lot of relationship dysfunctionality between all the characters, and it wasn't really necessary because what she basically pointed out that everyone's relationship with their husband or whatnot was pretty dysfunctional.
Okay, so just like every stone you turn, there's like this dysfunction, universal dysfunction. It's like, which is in a way, it's another literary genre. It's like the small town novel. Right? If you've ever read, for example, Sinclair Lewis, the American writer who writes about the Midwest, or for that matter, Jonathan Franzen, recent contemporary writer, where they take these characters that are almost familiar to us as iconic of the small town, and then they make them look horrible, and they're very unsympathetic, and they look down on them and so forth. It's a very typical kind of form, not the opposite of our town, right? It's the dysfunctional small town, right? Twin Peaks. Beneath the placid surfaces are these horrible relationships, murderous relationships, dysfunctional relationships, abuse, and so forth. Very easy to do to the small town, right? And maybe that's what's going on here. Actually, the rest of her novels are set in the capital or right next to the capital of Finland, the municipality of Espoo, which is kind of like the east side to Seattle. And so they're set in an urban setting or suburban setting, and very different in tone with relationship to rurality. But here they're out in the sticks, sort of. So let's turn then to one more question here, and those come back to the point about emotions that we started with. And the question I wanted to finish with was, how does Kallio investigate, and what part are emotions a part of her investigations? So that is, it can be both her internal emotions and those cultural scripts. We talked about it a little bit. What I'd like you to do is make an argument about how emotions work for her as an investigator. So just talking together, come up with a kind of a statement about how you think emotions work for her as an investigator, and then we'll talk about that as a class.
She always puts off. But also at the same time, she doesn't like sharing all that information with the that's me personally. I don't know what you guys think. I would argue that I think it Johnny too. When it seemed like it was going to be Johnny, you know what I mean? So, eventually she does, but as an investigator, I feel like it wouldn't happen. Instead of what do you think? She was straightforward. Oh yeah. I think I have no other choice. She's just puffed up. But I feel like that's after she got over the slump. Like after she's like, okay, I finally got it. Like, and then she's like, there's no way of keeping her.
Yes.
That's not fair. Sorry. James Cameron. Getting it slowly but surely. I had to spend the weekend looking at the picture. Good job. Yeah. And there's something that is just always right
Okay, let's hear what people had to say here in the last. We have 10 minutes left, so we'll try to work through different arguments. So what I asked you to do is write down something or come up with a statement about how emotions are a part of her investigations. Charlie, you got your hand up right away, so we'll start with you.
Maria spends a lot of time, like, not specifically like in the field when she's by herself, thinking about her relationships with people and relationships among her friends, and she uses that to like intuitively decide which path would probably be the most beneficial for her to follow.
Okay, so she thinks a lot about the relationships she has to others, and that guides her choices in the investigation. Thoughts about that? Responses?
We said kind of the same thing.
Yeah.
I totally agree, because like even though she did, you know, she like seemed like the calm, the storm or whatever, she still like her emotions drove where she like put her energy in investigation and like even like going as far as like avoiding people like Ella. Like, you know, she should have talked to her immediately when she found out about like the fingerprints on the brooch, and plus she knew it was hers. But instead, because of her emotions towards Ella, because of their friendship and like, you know, all of that, like it steered her away from it. Where instead she could have just like went straight. If that wasn't a friend or like she had no emotional ties, like that would have been like the first person she had.
So almost, what would you call that? Avoidance? I don't know. Christine? Reluctance?
To incriminate her friends. So it's a very much innocent infiltrating guilty system.
Okay,
Very,
so
very strongly invested in helping everyone's innocent.
innocence and hope guide her, right? She doesn't want, she's afraid of what she might find out, right? So, should we can I put that, afraid of what she might find? And so, as a result, I mean, certainly she says that directly about Johnny, right? That she doesn't want to talk to him because she's afraid of what she might find. There's so much circumstantial evidence that she is reluctant. So in that case, her emotions really shape. It's like she doesn't go to the doctor because she's afraid of what the doctor might tell her. Right? Cameron?
In regards to that, that also played a part with Jaska. When she went to talk to him, she ended up getting all nostalgic and playing with the band, and just didn't want to ruin a good day, so she left it off to another time. And
Okay.
He died before she could.
Okay, so leave right. So we'll say that the Jaska instance, pleasure, or should we say, pleasure of old friends disrupts investigation. So that, as Cameron pointed out, she wants to go back to old times, and as a result, she doesn't do her job in the present. The personal gets in the way of the professional, to come back to the point we made about investigation at the beginning, and that's one of the conflicts that the novel tries to work with, that the personal and the professional get mixed up in ways that obstruct the investigation. She'll put that personal, emotional disrupts professional. This is the personal disrupting the professional, right? I can't spell, and so I'm like my personal hang-ups on my spelling are like. So yeah, this is like a thesis here, right? The personal disrupts the professional, and this is the struggle. This is the main struggle that she has in the novel. And what does that tell us? Because, for example, we've noted that gender is an important part of this novel. Is this an attempt to think about a double standard? Would this Koivu, would he have the same sorts of problems that Maria has with the personal? In fact, there's a sort of a parallelism between the two characters. He has this sort of messy personal life with this Anita, who has fallen in love with a skinhead and is going the wrong direction, whatever. And so his personal life is a mess, and he's not kicked out of his apartment and so forth and so on. And it doesn't seem to be held against him. He seems to not suffer for it. Whereas her investigation is seriously disrupted by her personal relationships. Maybe she would have saved Yaska's life if she would have had more professionalism or perception, as Cameron suggests. So this can be, that is an argument. You could make an argument about a double standard of gender expectations, emotional styles, and so forth on that evidence. Kaya, right, yeah.
You were talking about how she's not exactly confident in her decisions, and she spends a lot of time thinking about the what ifs and what could be. And in that case, that influences her investigative process because she kind of thoroughly thinks about everything before she comes to any solid conclusions.
Good point. This is, again, a great sort of thoughtful point that didn't come up in the previous discussion, but that her emotional style leads her to continually be ruminating on other possibilities or other choices, which we can read as indecisive, and that impacts the investigation. Oftentimes, that this takes it in a very different direction, but, they could also have something to do with gender. What do we look for in a leader? What do we look for in the leader of an investigative team? Right? She actually delegates that off to this Järvisalo from another town or a bigger municipality, and then in a way that's a lack of confidence on her part. I'm too young to do this. I'm just a temporary person here and so forth. What leads her to have those feelings? And then it does. Her sort of second guessing of course, generates a lot of text, but then it tends to undermine some of her decision making in the investigation. Interesting to think about, what are our notions about decisiveness in leadership and for example, in an investigative role, right? We tend to think, make that decision, move on, assign responsibilities. She's a little bit different that way. Other theses that people came up with. Name?
But also I think if she were to decide so fast, she would have caught Johnny and then kick it and go off.
Okay. So, thinking through choices leads to success. So that in that case, the second guessing, you can see that there was lots of evidence for Johnny, and really Keevan was trying to set him up, and by the laws of the genre. And here she figures things out because she pauses a little bit and thinks things through a little bit more thoroughly. And so there we see that that's coded in a positive way. Looks good that she took the time. Good. Other things about that statements that people came up with or that differ with what we've come up with so far or resonate with it? Yeah. What name?
Sheridan. The whole male versus female thing in the police department, and the whole strip club thing isn't a main plot, but that she doesn't want to find violation because all the guys would be mad at her, but at the same time it's the right thing doing her job.
Okay. should we say gender intimidation? Is that a little bit where it's not like they're overtly intimidating her, but it's hard for her to do the right thing because she's afraid of the expectations of all these men around her. There's actually we didn't mention that one, but this whole strip club thing could go again into that same box of social issues, social criticism. Whereas clearly the novel wants to put that out there for us to think about. You could get rid of it; it wouldn't change it that much, except it deepens the depiction of the struggles that she's having because of these gender scripts and emotions. So she's actually very angry about that or very uncomfortable with it, and yet she can't say it outright because she feels it wouldn't get a hearing or it would be laughed at or so forth. And that impacts the investigation. Yeah, good, excellent point. And that's what the thing is that I like about these two is that people are tying them to specific examples where you could go to that passage and talk about what's going on there and analyze it to generate evidence for how the investigation works and how emotion plays into it. So the reason we've talked about this is it helps us think about how those keywords, investigation and emotion, help us read the novel. And I think in talking about the novel through these terms, we've gotten a pretty good reading of it, both how it works formally and how it works culturally in the way it wants to be socially critical. So that's where we're going to end today, and we turn next to by Karen Fossum, which is a novel from Norway. Have a good weekend.